If you go back to about 1500, the British Empire is just starting to grow. There's about 4 million people in the world who speak English. And then it takes off over the next 500-600 years. What happened? How is it that it goes from being this small secondary language to now being the dominant global international language?
So colonialism and imperialism is really the story of that. So it was the British Empire that kind of set the stage for English becoming the global language that it is. I mean, the sun never sets.
But the French did that, and so did the Spanish.
But not to the same extent as the English did. So one thing to think about in terms of kind of where we see English spoken around the world is kind of English has native varieties, kind of vestiges of the I was going to say the Roman Empire, the English colonialism scheme,
British Empire,
the British Empire all over the world. Where if we look at a language and kind of a colonial empire like the Spanish, right, they really put a lot of their energy into South America, and so we have all of these countries in South America that speak Spanish or Portuguese, kind of related to that kind of colonial push that we get there. And one thing that then is interesting about that is there are more native speakers of Spanish in the world than there are native speakers of English, partially because of this, right?
So English isn't the number one native speaker language.
No, yeah. So
even though it's so international in scope.
Right. So where we see kind of English really standing out is the number of people who speak it as a second language. And again, this comes from the British Empire, where it was kind of introduced. So if we think about a context like India, where there are hundreds and hundreds of languages that are spoken in India, English is introduced there as this colonial language that then is associated with education, associated with kind of the scientific and industrial advancement of the time. And so it's this kind of second language that you learn for that aspect of life. It's not necessarily, in that case, going to be the language that replaces your home language.
So that also introduces the aspects of, you talked about science and engineering, but also commerce. And I think that by the time the British Empire comes along, we're starting to look at international trade, and English starts to dominate there.
Yeah, so in terms of international trade, again, we have kind of English dominating in terms of the British Empire being this big influence that it was. We also have England associated with the Industrial Revolution and all the cool technology that's coming because of that. And one thing that did in terms of science was that it drew people from all over the world, continental Europe in particular, to England to be part of that kind of sphere, to be creating really exciting kinds of things. And so that then meant that all of these technological advancements were being discussed and talked about in the English language. So this is where English really starts to get its kind of scientific and technological boost associated with creativity and opportunity associated with that.
Well, and the same is true of aviation. I understand that the language of aviation around the world is English. And so this adds another element to it.
Right, exactly. So with all of this, so what we want to be thinking about in terms of kind of the British Empire laid this foundation for English being spoken around the globe. But then as kind of the British Empire was, as the sun was setting on the British Empire, the United States was becoming economically more powerful and having that kind of influence. So it was just kind of a trading of hands of English-speaking countries that really kind of allowed this maintenance of English as a global language to come about. The aviation bit really comes through at the end of World War II, where we have kind of the Allied forces coming together to kind of starting to decide on some kind of shared rules and regulations for aviation. Two of the big powers in the Allied forces spoke English. Most of the major manufacturers of aircrafts were being done, those were located in the US. And so it's kind of, again, just most of the people who are involved in this are speaking English. So that's what makes English the language that's chosen for these kinds of things. One thing that's really important to remember in all of this is that there's nothing special about English that makes it good at these kinds of things, other than it seems to be the language that everyone is using for it. It seems to be the language that's in the right place at the moment of these technological advances, at the moment of these economic opportunities. There's nothing inherent in the structure of language that makes it better at these kinds of things.
Well, now you add in IT. The explosion of IT in the last 25 years has gone global, and where does all that development happen? In the United States.
Exactly, yeah. So if you think about kind of the long history of the internet, it's something that's kind of the precursors are developed in the 1960s in the US, where it's a way to network academic institutions, government institutions, all of these kind of groups talking together using English predominantly because they're in the United States. In the 1980s, when this gets kind of released to the world, kind of sharing with other groups, I don't know the specific history of this, but I can imagine that the first people that the US invited into this relationship were countries like Canada, countries like England, that where now we have this kind of connection of English. And so right from the beginning, most of the internet was in English, and that's kind of maintained a foothold as the language of online interaction.
So right now, how many people in the world have English as their first language?
English as their first language, I have those numbers for me because those are certainly not numbers I'm going to remember off the top of my head. So kind of the estimates are around, 360 million speakers.
360.
Million speakers, native speakers of English worldwide. And I think an important point here is to clarify what we mean by native speaker, which doesn't have an easy definition associated with it at all. Kind of generally, we think of people who are native speakers as individuals who've learned a language in kind of a natural environment. Typically, it's the first language you hear from birth, but you can be bilingual and kind of be exposed to English around 2, 3, 4, or 5, and still be considered a native speaker by most definitions. So kind of there's some squishiness with these numbers because there's squishiness with these definitions.
Love your use of language. Very descriptive. How many people speak English around the world?
Around the world. So in terms of total numbers of speakers, kind of if we put together first language and second language speakers, it's around 100. Wait, what's the number? Over 1 billion speakers of English worldwide.
I heard that it was more like 1.5 billion.
I'm not surprised. So all of these kinds of numbers, of course, are total estimates, right? It's hard to count these kinds of things. It's contentious even to say kind of what's the difference between a language and a dialect. So kind of grouping these things like this. So it's not an easy kind of count to make.
I was reading something that estimates that by 2039, China will be the #1 English-speaking country in the world.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not a surprise. So lots of countries use English as their kind of primary language, foreign language that's taught in schools. And it's
South Korea being one of them.
Where there are huge pushes really early on to learn English. And the idea behind that is kind of it's a language that's associated with economic opportunity. I think one thing with all of these things we always want to keep in mind, though, is whether kind of this use of English worldwide is still this kind of British and American cultural imperialism taking over. And we want to be kind of sensitive to criticisms about that kind of thing.